All right. Welcome to the first session of our course at Unregistered Academy on the Bible. This is part of our Great Book series at the Academy, which spans the history of Western philosophy from the ancient Greeks, Plato and Aristotle et al., all the way through the 20th century with postmodernist thinkers like Foucault. I was an instructor in the Great Books course program at Columbia University at the beginning of my career. And so I have taught this course series before. Um, and was easily the most intellectually satisfying and influential and important thing I've ever done was teaching the Great Books course at Columbia. Very glad to this day that I did gain a fairly intimate knowledge of these books, which are, for better or worse, and there's simply no denying this, the basis for the culture that we all live in here in the West. It is the basis for what we know as Western civilization. Many of the assumptions, precepts that we all carry around, often unconsciously, you will see come from these books. Now, there is no book, and I think this is a universally agreed upon position. There is simply no book in the history of Western civilization more important than this one tonight, the Bible. Again, for better or worse, it just simply is, which of course is one of the, I suppose, tragedies or crimes or just self-inflicted wounds of the, whatever you want to call it, politically correct movement, the woke movement in universities. When I taught the Great Books course at Columbia, that was in the 90s. So that discussion was just beginning about the dead white men and whether or not we should ever teach them. And so thankfully, I came into this when it was still considered widely in universities to be important or even essential to teach and read and think about and know Plato's Republic and Aristotle's Politics and the Bible and all the rest of it. Um, One of the most spectacular things about teaching these books, and in particular the Bible, I've always found, and I've been studying the Bible since my first year in college. I took a Bible course back then. Is that you will see in almost every line of at least the major portions of the Bible, you will see in almost every line something that reminds you of the culture you live in now. Constantly, you're seeing things that are thought or assumed or spoken today in our life, in our world. And so, therefore, it's just there's simply no better thing to do if one wants to understand the culture that we live in than to read these books, and in particular, and first, probably is the Bible. And so, let me say before we begin another word about my approach to reading the Bible, who I am, and why that's relevant. I, as most of you know, was raised an atheist. I then converted to agnosticism when I was an adult, meaning I rejected sort of my parents, especially my father's absolute truth claim, negative truth claim about God and his existence, because I still maintain that there's simply a way to know or not to know. Um, but so I have come at it always from a secular perspective, the Bible and religion in general, and ideas of spirituality. Um, but I am not hostile, unlike my parents. That's what the difference is. I am not hostile at all. Certainly not to the idea of there being a supernatural God or there being supernatural things, or even the idea of some universal moral code. Again, I've seen zero evidence for that, but I am not hostile to the claim. And I guess more importantly and relevant to this course, I take the text very seriously. And I attempt to read it with respect not necessarily to the author, because we don't know who the author was, certainly in the case of the Bible, or what they intended, but with respect to the various important interpretations of the text. And that's what I will be trying to do in this course is offering what I consider to be the major interpretations and the most salient interpretations that are made about the Bible, rather than trying to offer my own in particular. I think it's simply more important. Now, the Bible, as I said, is the single most important text in Western civilization. It's indisputable. But actually, one might say that it's not so much the Bible itself, but again, subsequent interpretations of the Bible, right? We know that there were many, many, many extremely important theologians who wrote interpreting the Bible in the centuries succeeding its writing. People like Augustine and Augustine, who we will be teaching in the Great Book series as well, have interpreted the Bible in various different ways that are not obviously correct interpretations either. One people have argued that they're obviously correct, but there's of course much debate about it. There, again, very famously, in particular with Christianity, but even with Judaism and even with Islam, there are almost infinite disagreements about how to interpret the Bible, about what this book says. I mean, even the first few lines of Genesis, there have been entire denominations and religions established because of it. There have been wars fought over it, over what these words have meant. And so that's why, instead of pretending to offer you what I consider to be the correct interpretation of what we're reading, I'll be offering what I consider to be the major interpretations and the salient ones in Western civilization, the interpretations that have built the world we live in, the interpretations of the Bible, the Judeo-Christian tradition, it's sometimes called. Those interpretations are what have created the world we live in, at least discursively, at least intellectually, the way we think and assume about the world. Um, so I certainly hope that no one senses in me any disrespect to the tradition, to belief itself, to faith itself. Not at all. I think it's almost nonsensical to make fun of or disrespect faith, because faith is simply that. It's simply a choice to believe. And it's in that way it is unassailable. There is no way to criticize it because it is simply a choice to believe. It is therefore, by definition, irrational, outside the bounds of rationality. And so it can't be judged according to the norms of rationality, which is one of the reasons I appreciate it. It's a pre-modern in that way. Okay, so let's begin. Let's look at this tonight. We'll be, if I can find the share button, where did it go? Um, we will be looking at, as I said, the first book in the Bible, Genesis. The version I am using, can everyone see this, by the way? Did that share correctly? I want to make sure because I had an issue last week with the sharing. Can you see this screen? Yes. Okay. Um, so the version I'm using is the most commonly used version of the Bible. I can't see myself either. There we go. Um, the New Revised Standard Version. Again, I'm not saying this is the best version. I'm not saying it's the most important. Well, it is the most important in that it is the most popular, I should say. And it is the version that we used and still, I think, is used in the Columbia Great Books program. I believe it's the version used in most courses on the Bible in most universities. And I believe it's also the most commonly used in Protestant churches. Um, the New Revised Standard Version, although also known as the NRSV. So Genesis was written, we think, around 500 BC. This is after the Israelites returned from their Babylonian exile. It is the first book of what is sometimes called the Pentateuch, the first five books of the Bible, or the Torah, also known as the Hebrew Bible or the Jewish Bible, which constitute the basis of Judaism. Um, the Genesis, certainly the Bible in general, but Genesis is often, quite often interpreted, and I'm going to be spending a lot of time sort of with this interpretation as forming at least the intellectual basis of Western civilization, of what became Western civilization. And we'll be talking a lot about that. Um, Attached to that theory is that a central theme in Genesis, and this is where Jordan Peterson spends much of his time in his interpretation, and I think it's a very powerful and important one. We're going to be spending a lot of time on it tonight. Is that in Genesis in particular, it is a story of bringing order and harmony out of chaos, or creating order out of chaos. So we'll think about that as we're reading. Think about these themes. Try to remember these themes, these questions as we're reading. Another central, I think, the primary, and I think I'm not alone in this, the primary theme, perhaps message in the Bible, and in particular in Genesis, is the establishment of what is called the covenant between God and human beings, which is the basis of monotheism. There is only one God, and that God, most importantly, is not you. The original sin is depicted in Genesis as being one could say a version of self-centeredness, self-aggrandizement, egoism, which is the idolatry of the self, making oneself into God or godlike. That's the original sin. It is the fundamental violation of the covenant that there is only one God and he is not you. The plot in Genesis is that there is the creation of all things by God at the beginning, very famously. There is the fall of man, Adam and Eve. There's the eternal effects of the fall that are described. And then there's the beginning of what has been called the rescue operation, God's rescue operation. Um, After he creates the flood, destroying all but a few human beings on earth. This is the Noah story, of course. Out of the people who survive on the ark, he creates out of them a holy people with a mission to populate the earth. And one could very well argue, and we'll look at this, to govern the earth. That in Genesis, there is a granting of dominion, universal dominion over the earth to Noah and his descendants. God, now this is an interpretation that I find to be quite interesting and compelling. It has been made by various theologians I'm aware of. I think it's fairly common. I know that Bishop Barron, who's a very good theologian on YouTube, this is one of his interpretations of Genesis, is that what one thing that is happening is that God is making the world through speech. It's very interesting. It's almost a postmodern interpretation, right? That discourse or speech is reality. And it's interesting because Bishop Barron, of course, is a Catholic priest. He's making this interpretation, which I think is very powerful, and I like it a lot. But the world becomes intelligible through acts of speech in Genesis. And by making it intelligible, that in itself is making order out of chaos, right? So this is all sort of prefiguring modernity, and I worry sometimes that that interpretation right there is actually um, looking using what am I starting to say? Looking back at the Bible through a modernist lens, seeing rationality being imposed on the world here when the Bible doesn't really say that. But again, I think it's a very powerful and probably compelling interpretation for many people. So we'll look at that in the text. So again, reading backwards is what I was trying to say. Reading backwards from modernity, one can see if that's a good way to read it. And again, this is a common way of reading it. It's Jordan Peterson's way of reading it. Is that in Genesis, power is granted to rationality, which of course becomes the basis of modern Western science. And we also see in it something I talked about in the live stream last week, the not establishment or creation, but the further diffusion of the idea of the mind body duality that was established really by Plato, that the human soul is divided into two things: the mind, which is where rationality and discipline and godliness are, and the body, which is where wickedness and sin and depravity and pleasure and desire and Satan reside. And of course, we have not just the original sin, but the characterization of all human beings as sinful, as fundamentally sinful. At least I think that's a very standard interpretation of this. And we'll look at that. That's one of the last sections we will read. And so, what I suggest is to keep these common interpretations of Genesis, and I think these are among the most common interpretations of what's going on in Genesis. Keep them in your mind and test them as we're reading the text. Do these interpretations make any sense? Or are they just modern minds imposing their own ideas on this ancient text? And then here's questions that I have asked my students when I've taught the Bible for decades now. As you're reading it, just think about these questions. Who is God? How would you describe him? What is he? What is it? However you want to think about it. But who is God? Maybe that question you find to be either offensive or irrelevant or beside the point, which is fine too. That is an answer to that question. But think about who is God as he is depicted in the book of Genesis. A very important question that I've never heard other people make this interpretation. I'm sure someone else has, but certainly one of the first things I noticed when teaching the Bible was that it's crucial, in particular when comparing the Hebrew Bible with the Christian Bible, the Old Testament with the New Testament, is always ask, where is God in relation to human beings? You could even say, where is he physically? Is he standing next to people? Is he floating in the sky? Or is he somewhere else, like inside of us? And that, I would argue, is um, the fundamental difference, in my view, between Judaism and Christianity. That in Judaism, as you'll see in Genesis and the Hebrew Bible, God is always outside of human beings. And he's acting upon them as an external force. He's not inside us, inside our minds, inside our souls, inside our bodies. In the Christian Bible, of course, he inhabits our very soul. He is always with us. So Judaism to this day, by and large, I mean, there have been some very strange, esoteric, evangelical sects among Jews, but overwhelmingly, Jews have not been evangelical, not proselytizing. They've generally not attempted to convert people. And of course, Christians, at least many denominations, have evangelized all over the world. Third question, think about what is the meaning and status of the body? And you will see lots of discussion in Genesis of the body and sex. In fact, quite fairly graphic depictions of not just sex, but incest. Lots of sex in the Old Testament, and lots of ideas and statements made about the body. So think about what is going on with the body in this text. And of the mind. How is the mind depicted, and what's the difference between the two, the mind and the body? Of course, very famously, especially since the rise of second wave feminism in the 60s and 70s, Genesis has been read quite often as simply a a patriarchal set of commandments, which is something, one thing that's going on. I think that's fair to say, but there's much, much more going on with the creation of, you could say, gender norms. I mean, about man, what a man is and what a woman is. It's very much what is going on in Genesis, very famously, of course, with the story of of the Garden of Eden. But think about how men or man and woman are constructed in this book. And then what is the moral code? How should one live? What is being constructed as the moral code? And that might be the most important question to answer because that therein lies the basis of Western civilization. The moral code that is established in this book ends up being elaborated in Western societies over the subsequent millennia, and we are now living with the results of that. Okay. So, chapter one, at the beginning. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth, so he's created all things. So this is universal, right? This is a God for all things everywhere. This is not a God for a particular people in a particular place. This is a universal God. The earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep. So again, absolute, utter chaos, formlessness, no shape, no intelligibility. While a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Now, this has often been interpreted as rationality, reason, logic, again, imposing order on the world, lightness on when you light up a room, you can now see things and make sense of the room you're in. It's making sense. That's how it's been interpreted. Again, possibly by modernists, but that's how it's been interpreted. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. So again, lightness, rationality, the use of the mind is superior, better, virtuous. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening and there was morning the first day. And God said, "Let there be a dome in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." So God made the dome and separated the waters that were under the dome from the waters that were above the dome, and it was so. God called the dome sky. And there was evening and there was morning the second day. So there's now also a schedule. Again, from chaos, we now have order. There are days and evenings. There is ocean and sky separated, delineated. The world is now becoming intelligible, manageable. And God said, "Let there be lights in the dome of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years, and let them be lights in the dome of the sky to give light upon the earth." And it was so. God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night and the stars. God set them in the dome of the sky to give light upon the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, the fourth day. The fourth day. So order is being established or imposed on the universe that God is creating. God is creating the universe and he's creating order in it.